Going here. Sorry, we just closed the poll, so we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But yeah, just wanted to first off, thank everybody for taking some time today to learn a little bit more about Brinka and some of the challenges that we solve and the how we enable customers to really elevate their vulnerability and exposure management programs. My name is Jay Klauser. I lead our solutions engineering globally, as well as our tech alliances here at Brinka. And really excited to be joined by James Gordon, who I would say, James, you are quite the Brinka veteran and have had a lot of roles here. So if you want to just give a little bit of background on yourself and your experience and the roles that you currently have, as well as maybe some of the areas that you've worked at Brinka. I'd love to have you take a few minutes to do that, or a few seconds to do that. Sorry.
I could probably talk for a minute, but thanks, Jay. Yeah, so as Jay mentioned, my name is James Gordon. I'm the team lead of our Brinka Expert team, customer success engineer, solutions architect. Have held a lot of different titles as I've been with the company for about 9.5 years now. But focusing specifically on that team that I lead, the Brinka Expert, we are a staff augmentation team that's meant to come in and directly assist organizations with building out Brinka, recommending best practices, and understanding realistically how to get the best value in the most simple and direct means from our product.
Yeah, so basically you're saying you know probably about as much as anybody about the platform, and you've seen about every use case with our customers, and which is kind of why I'm really excited to have bring somebody of your expertise on the session today, because we're really here in a few minutes going to dig into kind of at its core, what are some of the challenges, and then more importantly, how have you worked with customers in real world scenarios to solve a lot of those challenges, or be able to apply a lot of the concepts we're going to talk about today. So really, kind of when you look at the challenge in the industry, especially around vulnerability and exposures, and trying to tie that to the proper context, and at the end result, understand what you should focus on first when it comes to your vulnerabilities and exposures. I think the challenge really starts with just many disparate, different sets of data. I think even, if you look at the left side of this slide and we talk about there's three kind of buckets there, but within each of those buckets, there's many different sources of data. In the tooling data, it's anything from, your traditional infrastructure scanners, your endpoint solutions that are scanning and understanding vulnerabilities and exposures on your endpoints, your servers. You also have your cloud sec like Wiz, Orca, Aqua, container security, right? And then you move into things like AppSec security and many others, right? I think that is a moving target, external attack surface management, threat intel, right? So it becomes really challenging to first off just be able to consolidate and understand the data coming in from these different sources, especially when they have different ways of rating risk. Some are CVE related, some are just misconfiguration related. So just really trying to understand and consolidate the data from the security tools is a challenge in and of itself, right? And then when you try to start apply and you start to layer on the asset context data, the information about what is this asset from a business perspective, right? What is it? Is it a revenue generating application? What is the data classification for that application or that asset? And we're really, who are the owners of that asset? So you start to try to layer in things like your CMDB and more, tags from your cloud services, right? This data seems to sit across multiple different sources. And then ultimately you have your threat intel. So how do we now take the information about the exposure and the vulnerability, we mirror it or add the context of the business, then how do we understand exploitability? How do we understand, is this a real risk or is it a mitigated risk in some way? And so, I think what we've seen is that organizations try to really, solve this problem first by just throwing people and bodies at it, right? And I think what they found, and that might be part of why we see that one of the big challenges, or the outsized challenge that people called out, was to be able to automate the prioritization and remediation, is it really doesn't scale, right? You can do that at a very pinpointed, very broad level with humans or even scripts and spreadsheets. We often see, companies and organizations trying to just build this themselves, which again starts to hit a wall at scale. And when you try to do it in an automated fashion, and then ultimately, a lot of the times, this data kind of just stays siloed. So you don't get the full value out of being able to contextualize these different vulnerabilities and findings, apply that business and environmental context. So you, at the end of the day, know what to focus on with your ticketing systems and your remediation teams, as well as kind of end up having multiple reporting tools or dashboards that are disparate dashboards that exist in siloed solutions and things like that. So it's really challenging to gain efficiency and automation out of this. I'm kind of curious, James, before we get into a couple of examples and into your where you'll walk through it in Brinka. What do you see when a customer is just starting out with Brinka, right? How many data sources, do they generally start with? What are some of the kind of initial use cases that they like to address?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, most of the time when we see customers start out, they do try to come in first with a very focused scope. So maybe only 3 to 4 integrations. That would include 1 or 2 vulnerability scanners, potentially a CMDB, and maybe even just an initial ticketing management system. At that point, the big focus is just knowing that there's generally an overwhelming volume of vulnerabilities that a specific tool is generating, and focusing on how to prioritize and get that volume down. As they start to reduce that volume and it becomes initially more manageable, that's where they can begin to approach adding in other tools, other types of coverage for their assets and other management systems. And we'll see many customers start to integrate well into the dozens of types of integrations. And I think the biggest takeaway that we've seen there, and again, as you mentioned, my experience here is we have seen issues where a customer tries to boil the ocean. They want to bring in everything because they know that they've got all of the data. But if you have all of the data, but you don't know where to start or how to use it, having the data isn't really going to benefit you that much. So starting on that focused scope and then slowly expanding out is what we tend to see gives the best results.
Yeah, no, that's great perspective, and I think I've seen that as well with just talking across, from the full life cycle of customers that are interested in possibly partnering with Brinker all the way up to customers that are well mature in the process, right? It's kind of like, exposure management and vulnerability management is an ever changing, landscape. And so the program really, never ends, right? It's just how do we continue to evolve it? And it's like, let's start with some really tangible outcomes to begin with, and then continue to build on it and, refine it on an ongoing basis. So appreciate the perspective there. Let's talk a little bit about high level context, right? I don't think that these are some pretty basic examples, but I think we see this all the time, and especially whenever I'm working with customers that are really just starting to think about investing and solving this problem and challenge. I think at its core, it's really about understanding that no 2 assets, no 2 findings, no 2 vulnerabilities are essentially the same, right? When you look and add the right context, and that context can be anything from data classification. Does it have PII or PCI or industry specific things like HIPAA for healthcare and other things like that? You obviously need to look at the business impact, right? So when you look at the business context, it's what is the impact to the business of this asset or the application or the data that it supports or provides or the service that it provides. Then you need to look at the environmental, context. So from a network perspective, where does it sit in the network? Is it externally exposed? What is the system configuration? What are the mitigating controls? So and then you obviously move on to things like the exploitability of that individual, vulnerability or the risk that exposure essentially results in. And I think, when you look at that, it's simple, right? You could have a very similar, same, server running the same operating system on the same hardware. You could have an identical asset from that standpoint, honestly, with the same CVE. And as you look at CVEs, they're generally going to have an initial rating, CBSS rating, or some other rating, depending on what you want to use. But in this case, if you've got this server that's part of serving up or providing your identity verification service, it's going to have result in being treated dramatically different from a risk perspective and all the findings to an internal dev server, right? And that's a really high level one, probably an easy one, maybe one that, as we talk about that manually trying to, solve this problem, you might be able to get part of the way there, right? With something simple like that. But they're not always that simple, right? I mean, they aren't always that cut and dry. Clearly, a dev server is probably not going to have PII or PCI, right? Where the identity verification service will. But we often see, to be really effective at this, you need to be able to look at multiple different and be quite specific with your ability to apply context. A little bit more challenging or at least nuanced, example would be I actually have two production customer facing applications. And the nice thing is, or not nice thing, the interesting thing, it's kind of based off an example of a recent discussion I had, and it wasn't necessarily a banking customer, but it was actually a critical infrastructure customer. And they said, hey, we've got, we have our control, our solution and our application that controls it was part of the energy industry, but it controls our devices. It's critical. It must be secure. It must be any vulnerability on that particular application, needs to be treated with the highest, most, urgency versus their kind of online manual and FAQ application. So this can be really applied to any industry. But when you look at the idea of, and this CVE is actually one that could cause a denial of service attack or cause your application to crash. When you look at that, even with two customer facing applications, it gets a little bit more nuanced, right? These are both production apps. They probably both contain important data. But when you look at that and you say, hey, our banking portal was revenue generating, right? Our online FAQ is not. So if we're going to prioritize remediating and resolving any vulnerabilities or any exposures on one of these applications, right, we're more than likely going to focus on and need to focus on our banking portal versus our online FAQ. Again, not that they're not both important and they're not part of our production system, but when you can start to identify and apply context at that specific level, that's really where you start to get the value of being able to identify, hey, this is where we need to focus and why we need to focus on particular exposures and vulnerabilities when we send that off to our remediation team. So I'll pause there. I'm going to stop sharing, James. I'm going to kind of let you go over, because really what we want to get into is, talking about how do we do that at scale and in an automated fashion. I think it was clear from the poll that was one of the challenges that those that are participating today have.
Yeah, perfect. We'll go ahead and jump in. And what I want to do as I start to walk through some of the data that we're looking at and how we built this out is actually go in and take a look at a little bit more focused scope, some specific vulnerabilities similar to the scenarios you've just explained. But once we get very granular, we can zoom out a bit more and see how is this prioritization, how is this contextualization actually working across the org scale. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right in, and we'll actually focus on basically similar CVEs from what Jay mentioned. I'll go ahead and search for a couple CVEs. We'll go ahead and just pull them up. So the very first thing that we can do across our environment is see all of the distinct instances where these CVEs are found. And one thing that might stand out, to anybody in attendance is that this one CVE is rated all the way from critical down to low. Of course, when we get that CVE from NVD, it's coming with just a singular CVSS v3, a v2, eventually a v4 score. But based on all of the additional context, based on what we know about the use of the vulnerability in the world and what we can determine about your environment and that information you can supplement with, we can actually better understand truly the impact of that. And as Jay mentioned, the very first item that we can take a look at is realistically the concept of the asset impacting both internal or external assets. That may be something that you have internal knowledge of, but it's also something that Brinka can out of the box help you identify. We've got just default subnets that help data mine class A, B, and C private networks. So just based on the IP space of host-based assets, you can immediately understand, is it potentially internal or exposed to the world? And when we come in and actually look at these, we've added in some details so we can see how this vulnerability is starting, how we're actually performing some modifications, and those end results. So here where I've got a vulnerability, and if we go ahead and take a closer look in at two different versions, we'll see we've got the same vulnerability in this scenario, which is deployed on an external asset. We can see that it's known as an emergency threat. It may not have any known business context. And because of that, we're actually increasing our score by a quarter of a point. That same vulnerability, though, located on an entirely different asset, we know that this asset is internal, it's a dev asset, and it's got deployed EDR. So based on all of those different factors, we're actually able to come in and reduce this same vulnerability. So immediately from that perspective, whether there's multiple owners or a singular owner on this, you're able to go in and start reprioritizing. Your scanning system told you that there were two vulnerabilities that were both a 10 out of 10. Based on the knowledge that we can provide from that context, though, we can immediately start reprioritizing and drawing those levels down. A lot of the information that you see here is going to be content that Brinka provides out of the box. So immediately we offer our own native Brinka risk intelligence feed, which brings in data from VulnCheck, NIST, EPSS, and first.org to help you understand and again contextualize what's really happening in the world. But we'll also be able to start layering in more of that internal knowledge of the asset context. And there are many different ways you can do that. One of the big topic points from the poll was also just understanding how to contextualize where that data is coming from. And when it comes to layering something with, say, is it a dev asset? Does it have business context? You can, of course, look to known sources of truth. If you have a CMDB, a lot of the times when we work with customers, there's always kind of a worry or a concern around maturity of the CMDB. But the truth of the matter is any CMDB is generally better than no CMDB. Even if you only believe there's 10% accuracy, that's going to give you 10% better data than 0%. So anything we can start with is always a good kind of marker to move forward. But when it comes to configuring this, Brinka also allows you to take internal tribal knowledge, data that an SME has, and simply build out queries to derive that information. So if you're worried that you don't have a source of truth, but if Steve sitting at his desk knows that all workstations starting with 1, 2, 3 are dev machines, we can put that knowledge directly into Brinka and have it automate out that process. Similar in scope, if we'll go in and take a look at a couple other vulnerabilities, we can actually focus on that other scenario where we've got similar vulnerabilities on both external assets. However, those external assets support different business functions or different applications that have different criticalities for our organization. So even though the vulnerability may be critical by nature, as a default, both assets are externally exposed. We can actually come in and start to consider for those upstream applications, the business services or the business functions that they support. Are they going to be mission critical, non-mission critical? Do they support or indicate a significant financial loss if they're unable to provide their functions? So here again, building from something such as tribal knowledge, we can immediately see, we have the ability to reduce risk based on low business criticality. Or in this scenario, we actually have the ability to identify if something is wholly not critical as well. And another great way of being able to just briefly visualize this is as we go into our finding types, this is going to give us a better kind of purview of just that specific vulnerability. So here we can see for that single vulnerability that we have items rated from a moderately high, of 7.6 up to a maximum of 8. But we can also have that same vulnerability downrated all the way to a 5.6. So even within that single vulnerability, you have that, again, ability to start to see and understand how is that going to be truly prioritized.
Yeah, James, I think that's kind of one thing I want to just make sure we highlight. I think that's ultimately I hear all the time as we're talking to, companies that are looking to solve this problem. One of the biggest challenges is, there's either been this loss of trust between the team asking for remediation activity and the teams that actually have to do the remediation. And a lot of that has to do with conflicting information from the different, individual scanners, but also just this idea that the teams are kind of feel like they're dumped on, right? Here's your spreadsheet of 10,000 things, and that doesn't mean there's not those 10,000 things don't need to be fixed, but with what you were talking about right here, we see same vulnerability, same CVE, initially was rated the same criticality. We can provide that really, really high fidelity and tuned list of this is where you need to start, right? And I think that, and then because of that, all of the measurements that are part of Brinca, the SLAs and the mean time to resolution and all of that, that can be adjusted to the new rating to give that team the breathing room they need to really focus on the right vulnerabilities with the right criticality, but also feel like they're being fairly measured on their activity, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, an additional key there is we tend to see people get very focused when they think about context of it's really around just the prioritization, where prioritization it's very important, but it's only part of the battle. Once we determine what's critical, it's then being able to identify who's responsible and then
Yep.
correctly route out those items. And so one of the context details that we see here would be both risk owner and remediation ownership. In Brinca, that's really modeled out from more of a management visibility. They're overall responsible for the risk, but then also who's directly responsible from an action or remediation perspective. And there are a lot of times where customers want to, again, try to get extremely granular, get as detailed as possible. But the very first step should really just be figuring out how to assign out that ownership, whether it's sourced in from that CMDB, an existing spreadsheet, or that internal tribal knowledge. One big area that we've seen customers try to focus on is reducing essentially the back and forth or churn on their ticket rates, where they're building out and creating tickets for vulnerabilities, but teams are just immediately closing them because they say, that's not my item, that's not what I own. So with that, as we actually get into the ownership, we do have the ability to get very granular in these queries. I'm just going to briefly show a query here for our client computing, where we may initially just assume that client computing is responsible for, say, all of our Windows hosts. This is out of the box looking at what can Brinca define as a Windows host. But if client computing can inform us that we're only responsible for the OS layer, we can actually go in and factor that in. And again, this is native data to Brinca based on things such as CPE analysis. So if you'd like to split out your vulnerabilities based on the application ownership, the server layer, the different functions that are running on that, you can get very granular on a single asset for who's going to be responsible for those functions.
Yeah, and I think that's great because you mentioned you saw the emergency vulnerability before. I think what I hear is if you get this working and you get this dialed in and you get this tuned properly, that emergency vulnerability, you can react quickly. And when there is an emergency vulnerability, there's not so much of the hot potato syndrome of, hey, that's not mine, right? And you know that's a challenge in of itself, but the reality is that delays your ability to actually go address that emergency vulnerability. If that ticket's floating around between two or three teams because you couldn't get specific enough, or it's a manual process that just is taking far too long to get it to the right hands, it really does impact your ability to react immediately or as quickly as possible. And so I think you touch on a really important topic there that I hear all the time whenever we're talking with our organizations. They're saying, man, these are the challenges I'm having.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, to jump a little bit ahead to maybe one of the questions that we're trying to answer is, as we build out this contextualization, what are the metrics that we can capture to
Hmm.
really identify that this is working? And you basically just hit the nail on the head. It's things like the mean time to remediate or even time to assign of a vulnerability. We can track over time how quickly were teams remediating before, Brinka was there. As soon as Brinka set up, what does that data look like? And then we can begin to capture trends and show how is that historically changing. As you're getting better prioritization, more focused scope on the critical vulnerabilities, and more quickly assigning the vulnerabilities to those owners, you can actually see how that decreases and really prove that the teams are being more effective at their process based on the data that they're being fed. And with that, I'm going to jump to one last area, back over to our dashboards, just to show a higher level view of what is prioritization and contextualization really doing at that org scale. So I've got a very simple report here that's giving just some breakdowns for items such as the original scores as they're brought in based on factors such as CVSS V3 or V2. And then how is Brinka actually going in and prioritizing them based on all of the different risk intelligence and environmental and organizational contexts? And immediately we can see that, we're taking that very top critical tower, anything that was rated as a 9 to 10, and drastically shrinking that down. That could actually be two items. We could be reclassifying items as critical based on where we know they are operating, but we're also able to go in and reduce that based on, again, the risk intelligence, but also if we know it's an internal dev asset, being able to reduce that risk specific to your organization. You can also then just see very quick kind of the drift in that from a risk rating perspective, so giving some more human readable kind of direct comparison values. But this also gives you the ability to go in and focus on distinct owners. So if you're trying to understand impact from the individual owners versus the overall organization, we can actually come and select some of the distinct owners and see how is that truly benefiting each of them. So here actually taking that critical queue all the way from 37,000 down to 1,000. So now that there's that more focused scope, and it's pretty clear to understand just from this visualization how that's going to help the team achieve those kind of lower MTTRs, aligning more to the SLA and compliance metrics that they are being tracked against.
Yep. That's that rebuilding the trust that may have been lost over time for sure.
And that about wraps it up, Jay, on my demo content. Is there anything else that you
Perfect.
want to highlight?
No, I mean, I think this was great. I know we're, right at kind of about the time to wrap up. I want to be respectful of everybody's time and so I think this has been, I mean, I think we're just scratching the surface, to be honest. So, we could probably talk about this for, 2 hours, but I know probably everybody wants to get on with their day. But no, this has been great, James. I very much appreciate kind of your perspective and just, being in the field, seeing this, working with so many customers from that, initial deployment all the way through to the maturing programs is, it's really been great for you to provide that perspective. If you want, let's go ahead. I think we have a couple of minutes here for some questions, if you'd like. So I'm going to reshare here so we can wrap up and get everybody on their way. There we go. All right. So let me just check. I think we had a couple of questions come in, but I'm going to make sure here. All right. Okay, so one that we have here, let me look, got a couple, and I think we probably have time for one or two. How about this one? This might be good. In your opinion, what's the first step teams should take if they want to add context for risk scoring?
Yeah, so I think, number one, just again, realizing Brinka will have out of the box context to provide around risk intelligence. So where we really want to focus customers on is anything from an org perspective. If you can help identify if the assets are internal or external, that's a great starting point. Not only is it going to allow you to prioritize, it's a great metric to be able to report on, being able to go in and quickly search down and find, just anything that is externally exposed versus only those internal assets. So that tends to be a pretty easy item to track down, especially when we've got kind of all the data that exists around IP addresses and network space.
Okay. No, perfect. I'm sure there's much more as well on that. We'll do one more. How do you handle assets that don't fit neatly into categories like shared services or hybrid workloads?
Yeah, so in that scenario, it can be a little bit of a mixed bag, honestly. A lot of it comes down to what else do we know about the services and the functions around them? Where are the workloads being used? What are the teams utilizing the upstream functions for that? And so that's how we can begin to, specifically on the ownership side, kind of see what locations are using those and share out the risk for that identification. From a prioritization perspective, again, understanding the upstream business functions that they support, the criticalities of those. You don't always have to look at the item that the vulnerability is directly found on, the asset that's found on. Understanding more of that upstream context can be one of the more critical
Yeah.
points.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yep. Understanding, the supporting infrastructure of an application is as important as, just being solely focused on the code, the vulnerability in the code itself, but understanding maybe there's a container sitting underneath that's part of the infrastructure providing that application to your customers, and being able to really see that and relate those is super important.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think just to, make sure we stay mostly on time. I think we had originally scheduled this for just over 30 minutes, so we're a couple minutes behind. I think let's go ahead and wrap it up. So first off, really quick summary, right? I mean, I think, if there's any takeaways from this, it's really just kind of, you know, talking about how context, it really can transform what seems to be an overloading amount of data or an overwhelming amount of data really into action and into information that you can, that to help you contextualize and prioritize those activities and really better understand, the vulnerabilities and the exposures in your environment. It really starts with visibility, right? Contextualizing it, and then being able to report and drive efficiency and remediation is really what it comes down to. And it's obviously, as we saw, you know, being able to do that at scale in an automated fashion, while there's many different, challenges out there that seem to be at the core of those who attended today. So hopefully this was just scratching the surface as we mentioned. Hopefully anybody who joined had got a good sense of, how Brinka can help with that. If you do have any interest, obviously we'd love to hear from you. You'll be receiving an email as a follow up. Uh, Again, really appreciate everybody just taking some time out of their day. We know how busy everybody is, so for those who attended, very much appreciate it. James, can't thank you enough for you providing your insight and experience, and really, making it clear and concise as to, how customers are using and executing and operationalizing, their programs with Brinka. And then I think just lastly, right, if you enjoyed this or are interested, we really hope you can join us next month. We have our next webinar, which is kind of a forward-looking, entitled "Your 2026 Exposure Management Playbook." So we'll have our chief, operating officer Brad Hibbert. We'll actually have our CRO Eric Helms, and they're really going to walk you through, some of the things that analysts are saying and predicting about the year ahead, to hopefully equip you with, some food for thought and, a blueprint for creating your own exposure management playbook next year. So again, very much appreciate everybody's time. We will let everybody get on their way. And again, thank you for taking some time, and have a great day. Thanks. Bye.